When I saw my husband leaning over my phone, my heart jolted, but not from the simple fear of being caught. It was the dread of him seeing those messages. The ones I had foolishly forgotten to delete. I moved toward him, a weak attempt to grab the phone back, but he held it just out of reach, his thumb sliding across the screen with unsettling calm. I watched his face shift, subtle flickers of confusion turning to suspicion, and felt the edges of my world begin to crumble in mere seconds. Yes, now he would see the truth. But not the whole truth. His hand trembled slightly as he scrolled further, and I knew he was about to find the one message that could ruin everything. The one that would explain too much and not nearly enough. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in his grip, lighting up with a new notification. His face drained of color when he saw the sender's name. He froze. Not even a blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, an old habit whenever panic takes hold, and the taste of copper reminded me how deep my nerves were cutting into me. I felt my own breath turn shallow, mixing with the sickening realization of what I had set into motion. His breathing grew louder, uneven, as though he, too, understood this was no longer about a single text. This was the fear I'd been carrying for months, the one that shadowed me from the moment I made that mistake, the mistake that reshaped everything. And now, standing there, I understood there was no stopping what was coming. But before I tell you how everything unraveled, and how one weekend changed the entire course of my life, let me take you back, to the very beginning, to the moment we packed for what was meant to be just another trip. The morning we set off for the lake, the air smelled of rain that hadn't yet fallen, heavy and metallic, clinging to the edges of every breath I took. I packed the suitcase carefully, folding sweaters I didn't even like, arranging toiletries into neat little rows as if the ritual of packing might calm the quiet chaos inside me. My husband moved through the house with the steady rhythm he always had, a mug of coffee in one hand, car keys in the other, reminding me to bring the charger, the sunscreen, the good walking shoes. He was thorough, reliable, predictable. And for years, I thought that was all I needed. Until, slowly, I realized predictability had turned into something else. Something like numbness. The drive took hours. The windshield wipers moved occasionally, swiping away drops that never turned into a real storm. I stared out the window, watching the blurred green of trees pass in a rhythm that matched the steady tapping of my fingers on my knee. My husband didn't notice. Or maybe he did, but he'd learned not to ask why I fidgeted. He filled the silence with casual updates, traffic ahead, the weather forecast, the check-in time. Beside him, I nodded, murmured responses, and wondered if he could feel how far my mind had drifted. We stopped for coffee halfway there, and when I got back into the car, there he was, my husband's half-brother, already in the back seat. He'd called the night before, asking if he could join us for the weekend. Something about needing a break, and my husband, being the man he was, agreed without hesitation. The arrangement felt awkward from the start, but no one said it out loud. We drove on, now 3 instead of 2, and the air seemed different. It wasn't just the cramped back seat or the extra suitcase crammed into the trunk. It was him, the way his presence felt like both a disruption and a spark. He was younger than my husband, livelier in a way that felt almost careless. He made offhand jokes about the radio stations, about the gas station coffee, about how my husband always drove exactly 5 miles under the speed limit. I laughed once, too quickly, and caught my husband glancing at me in the rearview mirror. It was a harmless moment, but even then, I felt the first twinge of something I couldn't name. By the time we reached the lake town, the rain had finally come, drizzling over the windshield, blurring the edges of every building and sign. The hotel looked like something out of another decade, small and square, its paint peeling slightly on the shutters. We went inside, tired and ready to drop our bags. But then the clerk frowned, tapping on her screen. "A mistake in the reservation," she said. "Only one room left, and if we wanted to stay, we'd have to share." I heard my own voice say, "It's fine," before I even thought about it. And maybe it was. After all, it was just one room. A queen bed and a narrow couch pushed against the wall. My husband shrugged, ever practical, already moving to sign the papers. His brother smirked, not in a cruel way, but with a lightness that made me feel suddenly aware of my hands, of the way I held my purse too tightly. The room smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old carpet. There was a balcony that overlooked the lake, the kind of view meant for postcards, but all I could think about was how small the space felt. The couch sagged in the middle. The bedspread was too floral. And everywhere I looked, there were reminders that we were 3 people in a space meant for 2. I unpacked slowly, arranging my clothes into the wooden dresser. My husband moved around the room, setting up his laptop, plugging in chargers, checking the Wi-Fi. His brother leaned against the balcony doorframe, looking out at the water. His reflection in the glass was faint, but enough to catch my attention. I shook it off, telling myself not to think too much, not to notice too much. But the awareness lingered, like static on the edge of every thought. That night we ate at a small restaurant near the hotel, the kind with paper menus and mismatched chairs. The food was good, simple, and my husband talked easily with the waitress about fishing spots and hiking trails. His brother kept the conversation lighter, teasing me for ordering sparkling water instead of wine, making me laugh in a way I hadn't expected. When we walked back through the drizzle, the streets quiet and empty, I felt an unease settle under my skin, not fear, exactly, but the sense that something had shifted. Back in the room, my phone buzzed in my bag. I reached for it quickly, hoping no one noticed. The name on the screen was one I hadn't seen in weeks, and yet there it was, glowing in the dim light. I turned the phone face down on the nightstand, pretending not to care, but the thud of my heartbeat betrayed me. My husband fell asleep quickly, the soft rhythm of his breathing filling the room. On the couch, his brother stayed awake longer, flipping through channels on the muted TV, the blue light flickering across the walls. I lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the floorboards and shift of fabric amplifying the tightness in my chest. This was supposed to be a simple weekend. A trip to clear my head. But as I closed my eyes, I already knew nothing about this was going to stay simple. The morning came with a haze that settled over the lake like a heavy sigh, and for a moment I almost believed it could press down on the tension that had crept into that little hotel room overnight. The light was soft, almost forgiving, as it slid through the thin curtains and pooled across the wrinkled bedspread. My husband was already awake, quietly lacing his shoes, his movements careful not to wake me, though I had barely slept. His half-brother was stretched out on the couch, one arm draped over his face, the rise and fall of his chest steady, almost theatrical in how unbothered it looked. Breakfast in the hotel dining room was quiet, save for the scrape of forks and the occasional murmur from other guests. My husband kept talking about plans for the day, a short hike, maybe a boat ride if the weather cleared. I nodded at all the right moments, but my mind was somewhere else, darting between what I felt and what I feared. His brother sat across from me, stirring his coffee lazily, his gaze drifting, then landing, then drifting again. There was nothing obvious in the way he looked at me, nothing that anyone else would notice, but I felt every fraction of a second of it. Later, back in the room, it happened. A small, careless moment that changed everything. My husband's phone alarm went off, a silly tune he always forgot to turn off, and he was in the bathroom. His brother reached for the nearest phone on the nightstand, mine, to stop the sound, not even looking before his fingers pressed the screen. The alarm silenced, but then the screen stayed lit. A message blinked up, one that shouldn't have been there, one I had been foolish enough to leave. He saw just enough, not a full sentence, not even the whole thought, but enough for his expression to shift in that barely perceptible way that makes you feel like the air around you has changed. He didn't say anything, not then. He set the phone down like it was nothing, like he hadn't seen a thing. But I felt my pulse in my throat. I reached for the phone, my fingers curling tighter than they needed to, and the room felt suddenly smaller. My husband came out, asking if we were ready to leave, his voice filling the silence like a patch hastily sewn over a tear. I said yes. I said it too quickly. The day stretched out with the kind of aimless ease that should have been soothing. We walked along the edge of the lake, the path muddy from last night's rain. My husband led the way, pointing out birds and boats, narrating details I barely heard. Behind him, his brother walked just close enough that I could feel his presence without looking. When our shoulders brushed, once, twice, it might have been nothing. But nothing can feel like something when you're already too aware. By late afternoon we were all tired, the kind of tired that makes conversation lazy. Back at the hotel, my husband decided to talk to the receptionist about local trails, leaving me and his brother by the small bar near the lobby. I ordered a drink just to have something to hold, something to do with my hands. The bar was almost empty, just the quiet hum of a television in the corner and the clink of glass on glass as the bartender wiped down the counter. We didn't talk about the message. We didn't even allude to it. Instead, he made a light comment about the weather, about how the lake looked better in the rain. I replied with something equally harmless, and yet the weight between us thickened with every passing second. I felt it in the way I didn't move away when he leaned slightly closer to be heard over the hum of the bar's refrigerator, in the way my breath seemed louder in my own ears. And then it happened. The pause between words became something heavier, a silence that carried a question neither of us had spoken. I don't even remember who moved first, maybe we both did, but the space between us disappeared. We kissed. It was brief, but the kind of brief that rearranges everything. My hand stayed wrapped around the glass I was holding, the condensation cold against my skin, as if the chill might undo what had just happened. It didn't. By the time my husband returned, I had already taken a sip of water to calm the pounding in my chest. I turned when he called my name, smiled like nothing was different, like nothing had happened. His brother sat casually on the bar stool, saying something about the dinner menu, and for a moment I almost believed we could all go on pretending. Back in the room, I unpacked the bag I hadn't finished sorting earlier, folding clothes that didn't need folding just to keep my hands busy. My husband talked about tomorrow's plans, his words floating through the space like background noise. And yet every sound, every motion felt sharper, because beneath it all, I could feel the echo of that kiss, quiet, deliberate, impossible to forget. The rain stopped sometime in the early morning, but the air was still heavy when I woke up, like the room itself hadn't shaken off the dampness. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, aware of every sound, the faint hum of the air conditioner, the shuffle of feet across the thin carpet, the quiet creak of the couch when his brother shifted his weight. My husband was already up, pacing softly, gathering his things for the day as if his movements might go unnoticed. I watched him from beneath the edge of the blanket, wondering if he sensed something, if there was even the slightest change in how he looked at me after yesterday. If there was, he didn't show it. Breakfast felt different. The dining room was brighter than the day before, with more people talking in the background, but I barely heard them. My husband kept the conversation going, a steady stream about the hike he wanted us to try, the weather forecast, even which streets in town were worth exploring. I nodded, smiled when I needed to, and let his words wash over me, but all the while my mind looped back to the bar, to that brief moment that refused to fade. His brother sat across from me again, stirring his tea this time instead of coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the mug. He wasn't watching me openly, but there were glances, brief, sidelong, measured. Each one was almost invisible, but to me, they felt louder than my own heartbeat. It wasn't just guilt that burned in me, it was awareness. And awareness has a way of making even the most ordinary things feel sharp, like sitting too close to a fire. We set out for the trail later that morning. The hike was supposed to be easy, at least that's what my husband said as he tightened the straps on his backpack. The path wound up a low hill, the ground still soft from the rain, the smell of wet leaves clinging to everything. My husband walked ahead, sure-footed and focused, calling back observations about plants and birds as though narrating for an invisible audience. I tried to match his pace but kept finding myself a step behind, not just physically, but in thought. Behind me, his brother stayed close enough to hear his shoes crunching on the gravel. Every now and then, our hands would brush when the path narrowed, just for a second. Once, when I slipped slightly on a slick patch of earth, his hand caught my elbow to steady me. It was nothing. A reflex, a kindness. But the way I felt the warmth of his fingers long after he let go told me it was more than nothing. The hike ended where the trail split into two routes, one longer, one shorter. My husband chose the long one. He always chose the long one. By the time we made it back to the car, my legs ached, but I said nothing. On the ride back, I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the trees flashing past the window, each blur of green giving me too much space to think. The rest of the afternoon slipped by in fragments. Lunch in town at a place that smelled like fried onions, a brief stop at a shop where my husband bought a postcard he'd probably never send. All the while, the tension hung there, unspoken, unacknowledged, but undeniably present. When we returned to the hotel, my husband wanted to check the boat rental schedule at the front desk. He stayed in the lobby, talking with the receptionist, while his brother and I went upstairs. The walk down that narrow hallway felt longer than it should have. The walls were lined with faded paintings of lakes and mountains, their colors dulled, as if even the art was tired. In the room, I busied myself with nothing, straightening the bedspread, moving my shoes, opening the window slightly to let in the cool air. He sat on the couch, not speaking, not moving much, just watching the water outside. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick, almost sticky. Every little sound, the squeak of the window latch, the creak of the floorboards, felt louder against it. When my husband came back, the room seemed to shift back into something familiar, something safer. He dropped his keys on the dresser and started talking about tomorrow's plans, about the trail we might try again or maybe the boat if the sky stayed clear. I nodded, but I felt that strange tug inside me, the pull of two worlds overlapping, one where nothing had changed and one where everything already had. That evening, dinner was quiet, the kind of quiet where no one says anything wrong, but no one says enough either. My husband talked to the waitress, polite and warm as always, and I found myself laughing at something his brother said, though I couldn't even remember the joke moments later. The laughter sounded strange to my own ears, like it belonged to someone else. Walking back to the hotel, the street lamps flickered on one by one, casting long, thin shadows on the wet pavement. My husband's arm brushed mine as we walked, his brother trailing a step behind. From the outside, we must have looked ordinary, three people returning from dinner. But inside, it felt like the ground was shifting beneath every step. Back in the room, I sat on the edge of the bed while my husband checked emails on his laptop, his fingers moving steadily over the keys. On the couch, his brother stretched out, flipping through channels again, the muted television casting restless light across the walls. I stared at my hands resting in my lap, my mind heavy with the weight of the day. The kiss we had shared lingered in my thoughts like a stain I couldn't scrub out, not because it was vivid, but because it had been so small. So quick. And yet it had been enough to tilt everything. The guilt was sharp, yes, but there was something else tangled in it, a quiet curiosity about what might come next, even as I told myself I didn't want to know. The morning began with a brightness that felt almost intrusive, the kind of light that crept in before you were ready for it. I woke to see my husband already dressed, sitting at the small desk by the window, checking his phone and writing something in his notebook, like he always did before making a decision. His voice was calm when he told me he had to leave for a day, something about a contractor nearby, an opportunity he couldn't pass up. He framed it as practical, harmless, something routine. But the moment the words landed, the air in the room shifted. I sat up slowly, trying to keep my voice even as I asked how long he'd be gone. "Not long," he said, "just the day." He promised to be back before dinner, to bring takeout from a place he had read about online. His certainty was comforting in a way, but it also made me uneasy. There was no hesitation in his voice, no suspicion, as if leaving me here with his half-brother wasn't even a thought worth questioning. When the door finally closed behind him, the quiet was immediate and deep. The kind of quiet you don't notice when three people are in a room, but that becomes undeniable when one leaves. I stayed on the bed for a long moment, staring at the spot where his bag had been, listening to the faint sound of his car starting outside. The silence he left behind felt too large, like an echo that didn't fade. The room felt different with just the two of us. Not just quieter, sharper. Every creak of the floor seemed louder, every movement more noticeable. His brother sat on the couch, scrolling idly through his phone, but he wasn't really focused on it. He looked at me occasionally, not long enough to make it obvious, but long enough that I felt the weight of it. I tried to fill the time with ordinary things. I made tea, flipping the hotel's tiny kettle on, and rummaged through my bag as if I might find something important to do there. I opened my book but couldn't focus on the words, the sentences blurred together, refusing to hold. I wrote a few lines in my notebook, grocery items we didn't need, a reminder to call someone back, anything to keep my hands moving, to make it look like I wasn't simply waiting for nothing. After lunch, we stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cool, the smell of last night's rain still lingering, the lake rippling softly under a pale sky. He leaned on the railing, looking out, his posture casual but too still. I stood next to him, holding the mug of tea I hadn't finished. The conversation that followed was light, the kind you could forget in an hour. Comments about the weather, the boats far out on the water, the way the mountains looked like they were fading into the clouds. But underneath, there was a layer neither of us acknowledged. Every pause between words felt deliberate, every glance carried something unsaid. There was no closeness, not yet, but there was an awareness that filled the space between us. Back inside, the hours stretched. He read for a while on the couch. I sat by the desk and wrote half a postcard I didn't plan to send. The stillness of the day became its own kind of pressure. When you spend that much time in a single room with someone, even the smallest details feel magnified, the sound of him turning a page, the way the light caught the curve of his watch, the way I found myself noticing all of it. By late afternoon, the sun had begun to fade. I opened the curtains wider, letting in what was left of the light. He stood, stretching, and walked over to look out the window, his shoulder almost brushing mine. The movement wasn't deliberate, not really, but it left me feeling unsteady all the same. When my husband finally texted to say he was on his way back, the tension in the room didn't leave, it only shifted. The ordinary felt heavier now. I heard the lock turn when he returned, his voice carrying easily as he stepped inside, talking about the drive, the contractor, the dinner he'd ordered. I answered with the same calm tone I always used, but in my chest, I felt the weight of the hours behind us, not because of what had happened, but because of what hadn't, and what still lingered between the words we hadn't spoken. The evening after my husband returned felt heavier than I expected, even though he came back with the same steady calm that he'd left with. He set the takeout bags on the small table by the window, his voice carrying easily as he talked about the drive, about how the contractor he'd met seemed promising. I smiled when he looked at me, nodded in the right places, but I could feel the hours he'd been gone lingering in the room like a shadow we couldn't shake. Dinner was quiet, almost too quiet. The sound of plastic containers opening, the scrape of cutlery, the occasional comment about the food, it was all so ordinary, and yet every silence between us seemed to press harder against my chest. His brother sat across from me, his posture casual, but his gaze flickered toward me in a way I couldn't ignore. Not lingering, not obvious, just enough to remind me that there were things between us we hadn't said and couldn't say. After dinner, my husband suggested a short walk, but when he stepped into the bathroom to change, I stayed by the table, pretending to tidy up the remains of the meal. The half-brother lingered too, leaning against the edge of the dresser. For a moment, the room felt smaller again, as if the walls had moved closer. It wasn't planned. There was no grand build-up, no words exchanged that could have explained the moment before it happened. There was simply a pause, a silence that felt too full, and then, without warning, it tipped over. We kissed. It was brief, but it carried the weight of every glance, every silence, every unspoken thing that had built up until that second. When it ended, I stepped back too quickly, nearly knocking into the chair behind me. I muttered something meaningless, something about needing to clear the table, and reached for a napkin just to have something in my hands. By the time my husband came out, the room had settled back into its familiar rhythm, the tension smoothed over like a wrinkle pressed flat. He didn't notice the way my hands trembled slightly when I passed him his jacket or the way I avoided looking too long in either direction. He talked about the walk, about how the air smelled fresher after rain, and I nodded, my voice steady, though my heart felt anything but. Later that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the blanket pulled up to my chin. My husband's breathing was already slow and steady beside me, the sound of sleep. On the couch, his brother shifted now and then, the springs creaking faintly under his weight. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. The kiss replayed in my mind, not because it had been dramatic or intense, but because it hadn't been. It had been small, quiet, almost hesitant, and yet it was enough to tilt the ground beneath me. It wasn't the guilt alone that kept me awake, though that was sharp enough, it was the quiet knowledge that there was no undoing the moment, no unlearning the awareness that had taken root. I turned onto my side, facing the window, and watched the faint light of the street lamp flicker against the curtains. The room was still, but inside me, nothing felt still at all. The morning after that second kiss arrived gray and thin, the sky outside the window low and colorless. The hotel room smelled faintly of takeout from the night before, a mixture of spices and fried batter that clung to the curtains. I woke before my husband, lying there still, watching the faint outline of his shoulder beneath the blanket, his breath slow and steady. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, wondering how everything in me could feel so loud when the world around me was so quiet. The first thing I did when I reached for my phone was check for new messages, even though I dreaded them. And there it was, a notification I didn't expect, from the one person who shouldn't have reached out while we were here. The name lit up the screen like a warning. I didn't open it right away. I just stared at it, my fingers hovering above the glass. I didn't hear him move, but suddenly his half-brother was there, sitting up on the couch, the springs creaking faintly as he shifted. He rubbed his eyes, muttered something about the time, and for a second, it felt like a perfectly ordinary morning. Then his gaze dropped to the phone in my hand. He saw the screen, I knew it by the way his expression flickered, by the sharpness in his eyes that lasted only a heartbeat before he looked away. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The silence was enough. He knew. I knew he knew. And in that moment, there was an unspoken agreement hanging between us, a fragile, unsteady thing that could break if either of us breathed too hard. I set the phone down, face down, the screen going dark against the nightstand. My heart thudded so loud I felt it in my throat. My husband stirred then, rolling over, asking what time it was, his voice thick with sleep. I answered too quickly, my voice too bright, and hated how obvious it must have sounded. The day moved slowly, the kind of slow that stretches and bends time. My husband decided he wanted to drive into town to look for souvenirs, to see what's around. His half-brother and I followed, the three of us moving together through shops that smelled like cinnamon and old paper, past rows of postcards and shelves of mugs with faded logos. Everything felt unreal in its ordinariness, like my body was going through motions while my mind stayed stuck on that unread message and the eyes that had seen it. When my husband went into a small hardware shop, the kind of place that sold fishing line and screws and things only he would find interesting, I stayed outside with his brother. We sat on a low wooden bench under an awning, watching the rain start again, light and steady. Neither of us spoke for a while. The sound of rain filled the space where words could have been. Then he asked something simple, about the coffee shop across the street, if I'd noticed the smell of bread baking. His voice was casual, but it felt like he'd placed something between us, a bridge or a shield. I nodded, said something equally ordinary, and yet my throat felt tight, like every word carried something unsaid beneath it. The rain grew heavier, tapping harder against the wooden awning, and for a moment we just sat there, listening. Back at the hotel, my husband carried the bags from the hardware store upstairs, talking about what he'd found, about how you never know when extra rope might come in handy. I smiled at him, listened, answered, but the awareness from earlier hadn't gone anywhere. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Reading half a chapter of a book, folding and refolding a sweater, watching the sky darken through the thin hotel curtains. Every sound felt magnified, the kettle's click, the sigh of the heater, the faint buzz of my phone when another message came through. That evening, the tension wasn't loud, but it was constant. My husband worked on his laptop at the small desk. His brother sat on the couch, flipping through a magazine he didn't seem to be reading. I sat by the window, staring at the lake, pretending the view held my full attention. But the truth was, the room felt like it was shrinking. Not because of the walls, but because of what was between us all, things unspoken, things seen but not mentioned, things that couldn't be taken back. Every movement, every silence, every glance carried more weight than words could hold. The rain came hard that night, heavier than before, a steady drumbeat against the balcony railing that seemed to soak through the walls. It wasn't the soft kind of rain that fades into the background, it was the kind that filled the silence, leaving no space for anything else. The wind pushed at the windows, making them rattle softly in their frames, and every few minutes there was a low roll of thunder in the distance. My husband tried to act like it didn't matter. He was always calm in storms, the kind of calm that made him think a heavy downpour was just weather, nothing more. He spread papers out on the small desk, talking briefly about the route we'd take in the morning, how we'd have to leave early to miss traffic. I nodded, but I barely heard him. My eyes kept drifting to the glass door leading to the balcony, where the rain streaked down in crooked lines, each drop catching the dim light of the lamp. The evening stretched into something shapeless. My husband eventually packed away his notes, said he was exhausted, and went to bed early. He kissed me on the cheek, his lips warm, familiar, and then turned onto his side, falling into the same steady breathing that always came easily to him. I stayed sitting at the edge of the bed for a long time after he closed his eyes, the sound of the rain filling every corner of the room. His half-brother sat on the couch, flipping through the channels on the muted TV, though neither of us was really watching. The glow from the screen flickered across the walls, painting them in restless light. I stood and walked to the balcony door, more to move than for any reason at all. The rain hit the glass harder, and I rested my fingertips against the cold pane, watching how the drops blurred together and ran in fast, uneven lines. The storm outside made the room feel smaller, like the walls were leaning closer, the ceiling pressing lower. I turned slightly, just enough to see him still sitting there, his eyes on the TV but unfocused, his posture too still. I couldn't tell what made me cross the space between us, if it was the rain, the silence, or the days of small, sharp moments that had built up like layers you don't notice until they're too thick to peel back. There were no words this time. No hesitation that I could name. The space between us was gone before I'd even realized I'd moved, and the weight of everything that had been unspoken collapsed in that moment. We spent the night together. After, the room felt different. Not quieter, not louder, just different. My husband still slept soundly in the bed across the room, the sound of his breath steady and even, and that sound felt louder than the rain, louder than my own pulse. I sat at the edge of the couch, my hands folded tightly in my lap, staring at the carpet, at the way the pattern faded near the edges like it had been stepped on too many times. The guilt was sharp, but it wasn't simple. It wasn't just about what had happened, it was about how easily it had, how there hadn't been a pause, a wall, a line that held. I felt the weight of it pressing in on me, even as the rain outside softened to something lighter, as though the storm had burned itself out. I didn't sleep. I lay back down in the bed before my husband stirred, the sheets cold, my body still and rigid beneath the blanket. When the first gray light of morning slid under the curtains, it felt like the world had tilted, even though the room looked exactly the same. The morning after the storm felt strangely still, as if the rain had taken something with it when it left. The light that crept through the curtains was pale and thin, and for a long time I just lay there, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. My husband stirred beside me, stretching the way he always did before sitting up, oblivious to the weight pressing down on me from the inside. The room smelled faintly of damp fabric and last night's tea, the carpet still cool under bare feet when I finally slid out of bed. I moved slowly, every gesture deliberate, folding the blanket neatly, picking up the sweater draped across the chair, placing cups in the sink like these small acts could erase the heaviness of the night. My husband smiled faintly, talking about breakfast, about the weather clearing up, about how the lake would probably be calmer now. I nodded, my voice steady when I replied, even though my stomach twisted with every word I had to swallow back. His brother sat on the couch, already dressed, flipping through a guidebook he didn't seem to read. When our eyes met for a fraction of a second, it wasn't sharp or accusing, it was something quieter, heavier. A silent acknowledgement that we were carrying something fragile and dangerous between us now. We both looked away too quickly, as if the very act of holding eye contact might make the silence crack wide open. Breakfast felt strange, even though nothing outwardly changed. My husband chatted easily, asking if we wanted to try a new cafe later, if we should look for a trail the locals mentioned. I forced myself to sip coffee, to answer when needed, but my hands tightened around the cup more than they should have, as if the heat could ground me. The drive into town should have been normal, just a short trip for souvenirs and snacks, but every mile felt longer than it was. My husband hummed along to the radio, tapping the steering wheel lightly, while I sat in the passenger seat staring at the trees streaking past, their branches bare against the soft gray sky. Behind us, his brother was silent, and that silence felt louder than the music. We stopped at a cafe with steamed-up windows and the smell of bread baked fresh that morning. My husband ordered for us, chatting briefly with the barista, his voice as even and warm as ever. I sat at a small table, feeling like an actor in a scene I hadn't rehearsed enough for. Across from me, his brother barely touched his drink, his fingers tracing the rim of the cup, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. On the walk back to the car, my husband carried a bag of pastries, talking about the shopkeeper who'd given him directions to an overlook nearby. I nodded, smiled when he glanced at me, but my throat felt tight the entire time. Back at the hotel, the afternoon dragged. My husband spread out maps on the bed, talking about the drive home, about where we might stop on the way. His brother sat near the window, silent again, staring out at the lake as the clouds began to thin. I tried to read, but the words slid off the page, refusing to stick. I set the book aside and folded laundry I didn't need to fold, smoothed wrinkles in clothes that weren't there. Every ordinary moment, the clatter of a spoon, the creak of the bathroom door, the sound of the kettle boiling, felt magnified, like each one was announcing itself. The room was unchanged, but it felt charged, like the air before lightning strikes, heavy with everything we couldn't say. When evening came, my husband left briefly to get dinner from the lobby restaurant, and the silence that followed his footsteps out was deafening. I stayed by the desk, pretending to write in my notebook, my pen hovering over the page, while his brother sat on the couch, motionless, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. Neither of us spoke, but the weight of what had happened and what couldn't be undone hung there, in every second, every breath. And when my husband returned, the door clicking shut behind him, the room shifted again, falling back into the familiar rhythms of conversation and clinking cutlery, but the undercurrent stayed, unbroken, just below the surface. The morning started like any other, though there was nothing ordinary about how it felt. The sunlight was thin and cold through the curtains, and for a moment I stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft murmur of voices outside in the hallway, the distant clatter of plates from the breakfast room downstairs. My husband was already awake, sitting at the small table by the window with his notebook open, the pen moving in steady, neat strokes. He glanced up when I stirred, smiled faintly, and for a brief second I almost believed that everything could slide back into normality if I just pretended hard enough. But the air in the room told another story. It wasn't loud or obvious, just heavy, a kind of quiet weight that pressed down on me with every breath. His half-brother was sitting on the couch, already dressed, flipping through his phone with an expression that didn't change, but I could feel his awareness like an undercurrent. None of us said what we were really thinking, and yet every movement, every pause, spoke louder than words. Breakfast was almost painfully polite. My husband talked about the route we'd take home tomorrow, how the roads would be clearer if we left early, and whether we should stop at a roadside diner he remembered from years ago. I nodded, gave short, careful answers, and forced myself to sip coffee I didn't even want. His brother sat across the table, eating slowly, offering the occasional comment, his tone neutral, but I caught the way his fingers tapped against the edge of his plate, the smallest flicker of restlessness he probably didn't mean to show. Back in the room, the day began to stretch in that strange, elastic way that time does when you're waiting for something, even if you can't name what you're waiting for. My husband busied himself with his things, folding shirts into his bag and checking the weather on his phone, his voice filling the space as he listed small tasks to do before leaving tomorrow. I moved through the motions, helping him pack, checking drawers, but my hands felt stiff, my mind not entirely there. At some point, he set his notebook aside and looked at me, his expression calm but sharper than usual. He asked, almost casually, about the messages he'd seen on my phone earlier in the trip, not accusing, not even sounding angry, just asking. The question landed quietly, but it echoed, louder than anything else had in days. I felt the heat rise in my chest before I could answer. I reached for the nearest excuse, the safest explanation, and tried to keep my voice even, steady. He didn't interrupt, didn't push, he just nodded, his face unreadable, as if he was tucking the information away for later. That nod was almost worse than an argument would have been. His half-brother didn't speak during the exchange, but he was there, sitting on the couch with his phone in his hand, his body too still. He didn't look at either of us directly, but the tension clung to him too, like static you can't shake off. The rest of the afternoon passed in that uneasy rhythm. My husband stepped out briefly to make a phone call in the hallway, his voice low and even behind the thin door. I stayed at the desk, pretending to write notes about what to pack, my pen scratching nonsense across the paper. On the couch, his brother shifted, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on the carpet like it might offer him an answer. When my husband came back in, everything snapped back into polite conversation, talk about dinner, about whether to stop for gas tonight or in the morning, but the earlier question hung there, unanswered in the way that mattered most. By evening, the room felt tight, the air thick with too many things unsaid. I folded clothes that didn't need folding, wiped down the dresser like it was my job, anything to keep my hands busy. My husband sat with his laptop open, typing with quiet precision, and his brother leaned against the window frame, looking out at the lake as the light faded into gray. No one said what they were thinking, but I felt it in every glance, every pause, every careful, measured word, the kind of silence that doesn't calm you, but leaves you bracing for whatever might come next. The morning of our departure felt like standing at the edge of something I couldn't name. The hotel room looked exactly the same floral bedspread, the same chipped dresser, the same weak light slipping through the curtains, but it felt different, as if the walls themselves knew something had happened here. I woke before my husband, lying perfectly still under the blanket, my breath shallow, listening to the faint sound of his steady breathing. The rhythm was familiar, grounding in a way, and yet that familiarity made the guilt sit heavier in my chest. Eventually, I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet touching the cold carpet. The small tasks of the morning began, folding clothes, zipping bags, checking drawers for forgotten chargers or stray receipts. My hands moved automatically, but my mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying moments I wished I could rewind, wondering if anything would have been different if I had made even one choice another way. My husband woke slowly, stretching, his voice thick with sleep when he asked if I'd started packing. I said yes, too quickly, too brightly, and handed him his jacket, pretending not to notice when my fingers trembled slightly. He smiled at me, the same warm, easy smile I had seen for years, and it hurt more than anything he could have said. Across the room, his half-brother was already up, his bag packed neatly by the couch. He stood by the window, looking out at the lake one last time, his face unreadable in the gray light. When he turned, our eyes met for the briefest moment. There was no lingering, no message in that look, just a heavy, quiet acknowledgement of everything we weren't saying. He bent down, lifted his bag, and the sound of the zipper closing felt louder than it should have. Breakfast downstairs was simple: toast, eggs, coffee that tasted faintly of metal. My husband chatted easily with the woman behind the counter, thanking her for the stay, asking about the road conditions. I sat across from him, eating mechanically, nodding at the right times, my mouth dry despite the coffee. His brother ate quickly, quietly, as if the meal was just another task to finish before leaving. When we returned to the room, the final steps of departure began. My husband double-checked the drawers, unplugged chargers, folded the last stray shirt. I smoothed the bedspread out of habit, even though we were leaving, as if some part of me wanted to erase every crease, every sign we had been there. There was a moment, just before we left, when the room went quiet. My husband stepped into the hallway to return the key, and for a few seconds it was just me and his brother again. He stood by the door, his bag slung over his shoulder, his hand resting lightly on the handle. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. And yet the silence was full, not of possibility, but of finality. When my husband returned, the spell broke. He handed me my coat, picked up his bag, and led the way out into the hallway. The walk to the car felt long, every step marked by the sound of our bags rolling behind us and the distant hum of vacuum cleaners in other rooms. The drive started the way all long drives do, with small talk, with checking for directions, with comments about the weather. My husband hummed along to the radio, his voice low and calm, the kind of calm that had always made me feel safe. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the road ahead, the trees blurring into green and gray, the air thick with things I would never say. His brother sat in the back, quiet, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. Occasionally, I caught his reflection in the side mirror, a faint outline, a reminder of everything that had happened, and everything that couldn't be undone. Hours later, when we finally pulled into the driveway of our home, the house looked exactly as we'd left it. The familiar sight should have brought relief, but instead it felt strange, almost hollow. My husband carried the bags inside, talking about unloading the car, about dinner, about everything and nothing at all. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him move through the house, the weight of the trip still pressing on my chest. Behind me, his brother lingered on the porch, shifting his bag on his shoulder before finally stepping inside. There were no words exchanged as he left later that evening, just a nod, a faint, unreadable look, and then the sound of the door closing softly behind him. The silence that followed was different from the silence in that hotel room. It wasn't sharp or heavy, it was hollow. My husband sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the mail, asking if I wanted tea, if I was tired. I answered, my voice even, but inside, everything felt unsteady. The trip was over. The bags were unpacked. The rooms we'd stayed in would be cleaned, the bed made fresh for someone else, as if we'd never been there. But the weight of what had happened wasn't something that could be folded away or erased. And as the evening slipped into night, I understood something with a clarity that was almost painful. There would be no undoing, no forgetting. The silence might soften over time, but it would always be there, a quiet echo beneath everything that came after.